So for this week, we are going to take a walk right on the border of Brooklyn and Queens. So I wasn't posting any videos in February, but that does not mean I wasn't hard at work creating some content. For instance, I have been out to Jones Beach, which was my video for last week. And also, I took a walk along the Ridgewood Reservoir where we are today. So, the Ridgewood Reservoir was actually Brooklyn's source of clean water as the city was expanding. So eventually there were 3 basins, 1 and 2 were the original ones, and basin number 3 was completed a few years later. Here on Google Maps, you can clearly see the 3 different basins, the 3 different sections. And so we will begin our walk in basin number 3, and then we will walk around and finally finish from the other side in basin number 1. But it is hard to believe that what you are looking at right now used to be filled with millions of gallons of fresh clean water. But as you see today, well, since 1989, both basin 1 and 3 have been drained, and water only remains in the middle basin number 2. But here is a photo from 1874 where you see the reservoirs filled with water. The other thing that I also find really cool is the iron fence itself that goes around the reservoir. I don't know, but there's something special about the fact that they incorporated the street lights into the fence itself. So they could have moved the lights or the fence just a little bit forward or backward so that they would not be in each other's way, but they decided to combine them together by placing the lights in the middle of the fence, which, as you can see, required for the fence to be especially shaped around the lights. And I'm pretty sure that added to the complexity of the fence being produced and probably hence its price. But in my view, it does look pretty unique and appealing even after all these years. And also, as you see, since this was drained for about 35 years now, nature slowly is reclaiming the land for itself. And only when you look on the sides, you can see the walls of the reservoir being slowly covered by nature itself. So here's the thing, you have to remember that Brooklyn, Queens, and New York City, meaning Manhattan, were separate cities. And only were they all joined together as one in 1898. And part of the reason why this happened was access to clean water. So, starting in 1842, Manhattan began getting clean water through the Croton Aqueduct system, which I actually did a video on. So I will leave the link to that video at the end. But Manhattan solved its problem with providing fresh water to its people. However, that system was not expanded to Brooklyn or Queens because they were separate cities, and hence they had their own water supply. But throughout the 1800s, the population of Brooklyn kept increasing. For instance, in 1850, the population of Brooklyn was probably a little bit over 100,000 people. Again, please don't quote me on these numbers. I would really have to look up the statistics and sources. But from the top of my head, what I remember, it was roughly about 100,000, maybe a little bit more than that in 1850. And then when you fast forward about 40 years or so 1890s, you're slowly approaching 1 million. So that really was putting a lot of pressure on certain supplies, like clean water, for example. And in fact, many feared that the issue with water will prevent Brooklyn from growing even further, especially its businesses and trade, as all the companies will want to simply stick with Manhattan. So, you have the birth of the Ridgewood Reservoir, which, I mean, you know, it had its limits, like I will mention in a moment, but nevertheless, for the time being, it was able to provide Brooklyn and Queens with clean water and it was operated by the Brooklyn Water Works. But here you see what I think is a influx chamber. I mean, I honestly don't know 100%. I would have to kind of like go down there and see it from the bottom. But I think it's the area where the water would flow and be regulated. And also, if you have like dirt or various debris, it would ultimately settle at the bottom and be separated from the water, and then you would have the clean water spill into the main basin for distribution. But here we are entering the area between Basin 3 and 2. And as you see, there is still water in Basin 2. And I have to be honest, it is really peaceful and just relaxing to walk around this basin. In fact, it is hard to believe that we are basically standing in the middle of New York City and, well, this is your experience. But just in case you do decide to walk these paths between the basins themselves, as you see, it is not paved. So right after like heavy rain or snow, it does get a bit muddy. I mean, it's not bad. It's not like you are walking in deep mud. It's fine. But just, take it into consideration if you are wearing like sneakers or something like that, so you can just plan for the trip. So let's get back to history. The city began purchasing land in 1856, and about 2 years later, 1858, Basin 1 and 2 were complete. So few options were considered in terms of where to get the clean water, but eventually the water came from various lakes and streams in Queens and Nassau County in Long Island. For instance, what today is Valley Stream State Park or the Hempstead Lake State Park. If you take a closer look at some of these areas on the map, you can see from what streams and lakes the water was used. There was a water conduit running from these places to the Ridgewood Reservoir, so it ran roughly where today is the Sunrise Highway underneath, and then made its way up to the reservoir. In fact, it is the reason why some streets have the names that they have, like Conduit Avenue or Boulevard, and Force Tube Avenue. All follow the path of the water supply. So water was coming in from Queens and Long Island, where I have written number 1, so Sunrise Highway today. Then we have Conduit Avenue, point number 2. At point number 3, there used to be a pumping station at Atlantic Avenue. This was demolished in 1960s. But the pumping station would then pump all this water under what today is Force Tube Avenue, point number 4. They would pump all of this finally into the reservoir itself, point number 5. And then from the reservoir, the water was distributed simply by gravity to all the different places that were connected to it. It is so cool to actually look on the map and see why certain streets are the way they are, why borders are where they are. So you see, history is not really boring, and like I tell my students, by studying history, it does not necessarily always mean you will become a professor or a teacher of history. It has implications into many other fields and areas, like even better understanding the layout of the city and how and why it functions the way it does. But here we also come across the gatehouse for basin number 3. So like I mentioned, basin 1 and 2 were completed in 1858. Well, in fact, in April of 1859, there was a huge parade in Brooklyn to celebrate the opening of the reservoir itself. However, Brooklyn continued to grow and they needed more clean water. Hence, Basin 3 was added and opened in 1889. And when it was added, the reservoir could contain about 300 million gallons of water. And here in front of Basin 2, we have the original gatehouse, which was used for Basin 1 and 2. There was also a keeper's house, as you see on this image. And here you can also walk between Basin 1 and 2, if you would like to. But yeah, so by the end of the 1890s, we have about 300 million gallons of water, but it was still not enough for the expanding city. And it also created a lot of problems, as for example, many farmers and people in Long Island, for example, began complaining that the water is being sucked out of the ground, and it was also creating weak water pressure, and hence causing problems for them. So there were ideas and plans to expand this further into Long Island, into what is the Suffolk County, but they were blocked. A law was passed which said that Brooklyn cannot use water from that part of Long Island. And when you looked at Manhattan and their water system, the Croton Aqueduct, it was simply better. It was superior. They simply had a lot more access to water. By then, you also have the Brooklyn Bridge, which opened in 1883, connecting the cities together. And, well, soon after, 1898, we have the birth of modern New York City, with Brooklyn, Queens, Manhattan coming together. So I am not saying that access to water was the only reason that this happened, but it certainly played a role. Many people welcomed and they liked the ideas of the cities combining themselves together, ultimately for access to clean water as well. The reservoir was still in use until the late 1950s because, well, I mean, it just takes time to build all the tunnels, connect everything together, and really glue the cities together. Even glued their water systems, right, together with all the connections. But even after 1950s, I believe 1959, the reservoir still served as a backup, really all the way until 1989, when it was finally shut down completely and drained, only leaving Basin 2 with water. So 1989, I guess it's the end of the Cold War, and in Europe you have the Berlin Wall that fell in Germany, and I guess here in Brooklyn around that same time period is finally when the city put an end to their chapter with the Ridgewood Reservoir. And as we turn to go back, as we are now in Basin 1, we can also catch a glimpse of the Cyrus Hill National Cemetery, which was the first military cemetery in New York City. Well, in fact, one of the earliest national cemeteries in the United States, as the national cemetery system really dates back to the Civil War, and so does this cemetery right here. But once you are done exploring the Ridgewood Reservoir and walking around enjoying the area, you can also explore the rest of the Highland Park, which was created around the reservoir itself. It's also a very nice place to walk and just relax, and there's even few interesting things to see as you are walking around. For example, that right there in the distance. This is the Old Stone Bridge, which was completed in 1902. So it's one of the original designs of this park itself. Over 120 years old. Kind of cool. So I hope you liked this video. Don't forget to check back next week, as again, I have some really amazing things to show you. So until then, stay safe out there. Bye.